The purpose of this lesson is to help you to understand the fact that there is no more adding, subtracting really whenever it talks about this stuff, and the way you read it doesn't tell you what to do. I think there's so many situations where you see a plus sign. For example, you see this plus sign and you think you're going to do 6 plus 10, or you see this minus sign and you think you're going to do 8 minus 3, and neither one of those two is you're going to see as right. So we need to kind of learn to visualize it. So the first thing we're going to do on part 1, again, you want to copy everything on this so that you actually can have the notes on what's going on. But the first thing you want to do is learn to separate the problem. So visually just seeing it and recognizing that this is a negative 6 and a positive 10. Those are your two numbers. Again, that's all it is. Visually seeing when you see negative 3 minus 8, which it's fine to read it as negative 3 minus 8. Hold on, let me focus this thing and see if it'll get clear. I think that's a little better. My eyes are no good, but I'm pretty sure that's about right. But when you see this, recognizing that this is a negative 3, and also being careful to see this as a negative 8. Those are the two numbers in the problem. But visually starting to do that on your own so that you don't misread the sign. Again, that minus, as you're going to learn, doesn't mean add. This plus doesn't mean, this plus doesn't mean add. This minus doesn't mean subtract. We have to make decisions on our own without that stuff. But also recognizing that this 4, which has nothing in front, is a positive 4. How do I know that? If you ask someone how much money they have, they don't say positive $20. They just say $20. If they tell you a number, you're assuming it's positive. So therefore, if a number has no sign on it, you can just assume it's positive. Same thing here. This 9 is negative, and those are the two numbers we're looking at. On number 4, we're looking at a negative 2 and a negative 8. On number 5, and we won't put boxes around them all the time, but this is just to help you visually see that we have a negative 9 and a positive 3. And then on number 6, you have, don't forget, that's a positive 8 and a negative 4. And so once you can visualize what the problem is, now you can start to kind of visualize what happens. So for the next two columns, we are going to visually answer these questions. And it is going to take some writing and some time. But keep in mind, we are not doing this visually to do this visually forever. This visualization is just for us to be able to kind of think through a problem with logic and figure out what we're going to do. So if you are going to solve this, and we know we have a negative 4 and a negative 2, again, write that down. If you're combining those two things, you're putting negative 4 as 4 negatives. You're taking negative 2 as 2 negatives. Notice that if you combine these two, again, combining, not adding, subtracting, but combining these, you end up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 negatives, which means your answer is negative 6. Now, again, that's visual. So as much as this might help you feel good about it, please don't try to bring this over to something else, because if I give you, and again, don't write this part, but if I give you negative 70 minus 105, you don't want to put 70 negatives and 105 negatives down. You want to be able to think your way through it, which is where we're going with this. So use this visual method now, but please don't use it like it's supposed to be used all the time. It's just to help you think through it. So here we end up visualizing this as a negative 3 and a negative 5. Again, hopefully you can see that. If not, talk to your teacher soon so you can try to get an idea on what you're kind of looking at wrong there. We do read this as negative 3 minus 5, but again, in terms of visualizing, it's a negative 3 and a negative 5, which means 3 negatives for this, 5 negatives for that, which if you combine them, again, combining, not adding, subtracting, but combining, you end up with 8 negatives, and that is your final answer. Now, I want you to pay attention to the fact that this is negative 4 minus 2, but you actually add 4 and 2 to get 6. I want you to pay attention to the fact that this is negative 3 minus 5, but you actually add 3 and 5 to get 8. That is what I mean by there is no more adding and subtracting. There is adding and subtracting, but it's not the way you read it anymore, and you want to be careful. Number 9, I'm sorry I made this boring. Negative 2 minus 5, which should be just like negative 3 minus 5, sorry, again, is going to be a negative 2 and a negative 5, which means that we have 2 negatives and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 negatives, which means that if I combine these two, again, combining, not adding or subtracting, I end up with negative 7 as my answer. And again, I want to point out, negative 2 minus 5, which is how we read it, does not mean subtract, because you actually add 2 and 5 to get to 7. In all those problems, the signs were the same. So logically, what you want to notice is if they were all negatives, we just put them together. If they were all negatives, we just put them together. If they were all negatives, we just put them together. But once the signs change, something else happens. So this is what we're looking at here. We have a -3 and a +5, which means we have 3 negatives and 5 positives. And here's what happens whenever you put a plus with a minus. Again, don't write what I'm about to write, but if there is a box that you're standing on, and you take one, or actually let's just say that you're on a game board, and you start here. If you take one step forward and then one step backwards, where are you? You're right back at the point you were. So how far did you go? Nowhere. Because if you go forward one and backward one, you just pretty much offset. So a negative and a positive offset each other, which means they kind of cancel each other out. You call these things a zero pair. A zero pair because the pair of these two actually make 0. So circle those two things and cross them out because your plus and your minus will go away. Again, we have another 0 pair here that will go away. And we have another 0 pair here that will also go away. And once all the 0 pairs are gone, you look at your answer. Well, your answer here is +2. That is your final answer. And as much as I'd hate to say I told you so again, look at this sign. -3 plus 5 is how we read it, but we did not add to get to 2. We subtracted 5 minus 3 to get to our 2. So again, do not trust the sign in terms of telling you what to do. You have to now think logically and realize if the signs are the same, it combines. If the signs are different, I have 0 pairs. And think about it, 0 pairs cancel. Cancellation is like subtraction. And so that's what we're going to be adding to our thinking before we get ready, before we close out this thing. This is a -6 and a +2. So we want to put 6 negatives down to represent -6. We want to put 2 pluses down to represent +2. We have to recognize logically that anytime you have a plus and a minus, that it makes a 0 pair, which means those things cancel, giving me -4. And once again, plus. It isn't what we did. 6 minus 2 is 4. But how do I know it's going to be negative? Well, there's more negatives. That's why it's negative. Just like here, there were more positives. That's why it was positive. So again, those are things we're going to be thinking about as we keep moving forward through this. And I think we've got 3 more of these before we actually do it without all the signs, because I don't think you need to keep writing the signs. Once you've kind of tried to get it, I think everything starts to piece together. Don't forget that this is a +4 and a -6. With that being the case, we want to put down 4 pluses and 6 negatives. Notice how I line my negatives up to my pluses because I know I'm going to cross them out anyway. But we do have 0 pairs. Negative and positive is a 0. Negative and positive is also a 0. Negative and positive is a 0. Negative and positive is a 0, giving us -2. This time it actually worked out that you did subtract. But again, do not trust that sign. Don't trust the plus or minus that you read it with to say that you're adding or subtracting. When I read this as -3 minus 5, it doesn't mean I'm going to subtract because I said -5. When I read this as -3 plus 5, it doesn't mean I'm going to add because I said plus. It's just how I read it. I mean, formally, that's how you read it. So there's nothing wrong with reading it the right way. But be ready to think and don't just assume anymore. You have a +2 and you have a -7. That means I put down 2 pluses and I put 7 negatives. 5, 6, 7. I think that's 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Again, this is a 0 pair and this is a 0 pair, leaving me with 5 negatives as my answer. And then on 14, looks to me like I have a -4 and a -3. No 0 pairs, so don't just go canceling things. I know everybody likes to do that once you start doing something. There's nothing here that cancels, so therefore we put them together and get -7. So that is your visual part there. Again, if you still don't understand this stuff, talk to your teacher. I'd say if you're doing this as an activity in class, pause the video, talk to your teacher, and try to have them kind of explain it a little bit more in depth. But as long as you've got the general idea, again, you don't have to be perfect right now. But as long as you've got the general idea, then you should be able to work through the next part of this, which is using logic, because these numbers are more realistic. I don't want you to put 76 negatives and 23 positives, 34 and 40. That just doesn't make sense. So what we're going to do is simply visualize what the numbers are. I'm going to underline them as they are. And then I'm going to say to myself, would these two make a zero pair? The obvious answer, because I see a plus and a minus because the signs are different, is yes. So I'm going to subtract. Again, the signs are different, and I'll just write these off to the side. The signs are different, so I'm going to subtract, which means that I get 13 minus 8, which is 5. And go back to all these things that we had. In every one of these problems, the bigger actual number got the sign. Then 4 was negative. The bigger actual number, 5, got the sign. The bigger actual number, 5, negative, got the sign. 5 was positive, it's the bigger number, it got the sign, and all of them do. So in this problem, our bigger actual number is 13, which means that your answer will be negative 5. So you're still kind of doing the pluses and minuses in your head. It's more of a background thought, which means you don't need all that paper. And again, you definitely don't want to put all the negatives down that we're going to be looking at here. Negatives and positives, I should say. On number 16, I visualize it as a negative 20 and a negative 15. These two signs are the same because they're both negative. Because they're the same, nothing cancels, and so you add them up. 20 plus 15 is 35. What type of 35? Well, visually, if my bigger number is 20 and 20 is negative, then it should be a negative 35. Again, you have 20 negatives combined with another 15 negatives, which make 35 negatives. And that is where we want to get with this. It doesn't just come to you like that. It does take practice, but just take your time. Make sure you don't speed through it, because practice makes permanent. If you practice it wrong, all you're doing is learning how to do it consistently get it wrong the same way, because you're practicing doing it wrong. So don't practice it wrong. Take your time. Go slow if you need to get it down. This is a negative 14 and a negative 6. These two are both negative, so I know the signs are the same. Because signs are the same, nothing will cancel. There's no zero pair, so I will add those two together. 14 and 6, again, ignoring the signs, 14 plus 6 is 20. The bigger number is negative, so my answer should be negative. On number 18, don't forget that's a positive 19 and a negative 25. If you have to put a plus in front of that, fine, but just start learning that if you see a 19 as positive 19, guess what? That's a positive 22 and a positive 21 and a positive 25. So you don't really need it, but if you need it, just put it. But you have a positive 19 and a negative 25, which means the signs are different, which means that I will subtract, because they're different, I'm going to have zero pairs. I'm going to have a plus next to a minus. Things are going to cancel. And the sign that means cancel or take away is subtract. 25 minus 19 is 6. 25 is a bigger number. 25 is negative. It will be a negative 6. Negative 34 plus 40. A negative 34, a positive 40. Negative and positive, different. Different means I will have zero pairs, which means that I will subtract, because I will cancel things, and cancel means take away. From there, if I subtract, 40 minus 34 is 6. The bigger number is positive, so it's a positive 6. Again, you don't need to put the plus in front of the 6, but that's what's going to happen. Number 20, positive 19, negative 10. Positive, negative, different. Because they're different, I'm going to have zero pairs, which means I will cancel or subtract. Once I know that, 19 minus 10 is 9. I then go to the bigger number visually. Again, you don't need to circle it, but visually I look at 19, see it's positive, and write positive 9, or just know it's going to be positive. Everything I'm doing, the words I'm writing, you can write them to get them right at first, or do them at first. And I do suggest, if you're really trying to get it down, that you actually do these things. But after a while, you'll just say to yourself, these are different, so I subtract, get my answer, bigger number's at, and the sign will just go there. It eventually becomes automatic. So if you need to write different, subtract, same, add, and then circle the bigger number, fine. But know that as long as you're practicing it the right way, eventually you will not need to write it, because you're going to be able to do it without. Negative 16, negative 10. You won't even need to underline it, because your eyes will just see negative 16, negative 10. Those two, negative and negative, are the same. Because they're the same, nothing cancels, so we will add. 16 and 10 make 26. 16 is bigger. My sign will be negative. Number 22. Negative 32, positive 20. Negative, positive, different. Because they're different, it means I'll have a zero pair, which means I subtract. 32 minus 20, those are what, about 12 apart? So that's 12. Bigger number's negative. Negative 12 is your answer. Doesn't matter how big the numbers get. You can do this. Negative 76, positive 23. Negative, positive, different. Different means that I will subtract. I cannot do that in my head, so I'm going to set up the subtraction based off the way I was taught. Bigger number on top. 6 minus 3, 3. 7 minus 2 is 5. Bring your answer back over here. And again, the bigger number is negative, so my answer will be negative. That's all it takes. You had this in you all along. You just had to learn how to piece it together. Negative 94, negative 49, negative, negative, same. If they're the same, we are going to add them together. Because we add them together, and I don't know how to do that in my head, I'm going to do 94 plus 49. I'm going to do 4 plus 9, which is 13. Carry 9 plus 1 is 10, 14, 143. And again, the bigger number is negative, so I put my negative down. As long as you take your time, you should be able to make it through this stuff. Number 25, don't forget this is a positive 57 and a negative 83. Positive, negative is different. Because they're different, we will subtract. So bigger number on top will be 83 minus 57. You cannot do 3 minus 7, so we must borrow. 13 minus 7 is 6. 7 minus 5 is 2. Bring that answer back, and then get your sign by looking at the bigger number. Negative 26 is it. Again, remember that practice does make permanent. Please take your time on these questions. Do not try to rush through it. It might take you 3-4 days to finally get kind of fluent with it. But if that's how long it takes, as long as you practice right, you won't have any issues with it again. Anything you're practicing wrong will be a bad habit, and bad habits are hard to break. So please make sure you take your time on this. And outside of that, again, ask for help as you need it. Good luck, and I'll talk to you later.